Have you ever been alone in your own home and felt like you weren't really alone? Like someone, or something, was watching you from the shadows? This is the story of Alex, a 22-year-old guy who experienced something so terrifying, it made him question his own sanity. It was a cold Friday night in December, and Alex had the house to himself. His parents were out of town for the weekend, and he was looking forward to a quiet evening of gaming and relaxing. The house was large and old, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows, but it had always felt like home. That night, however, would change everything. Alex started his evening by ordering pizza and settling down in the living room. He turned off all the lights, except for the TV, which cast a soft glow across the room. The hours passed by quickly as he got lost in his game. Around midnight, he decided to call it a night and head upstairs to his bedroom. As he climbed the stairs, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He chalked it up to the creepy game he had been playing and continued to his room. He closed the door behind him, leaving it slightly ajar, and got into bed. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, he heard a faint noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like the creaking of floorboards. Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, straining to hear any other sounds. The house was silent again. Alex tried to convince himself that it was just the old house settling, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He decided to get up and check it out, just to be sure. He grabbed his phone and used its flashlight to light his way down the dark hallway. As he descended the stairs, the creaking grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the living room. Alex tiptoed to the doorway and peered inside. The room was empty, the TV off, and the pizza box still on the coffee table. He sighed in relief, feeling a bit silly for getting so worked up. Just as he turned to go back upstairs, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the darkness. Alex's heart stopped. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stood there, motionless, watching him. Alex blinked, and the figure was gone. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was imagining things. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive imagination. He hurried back to his room, shutting the door firmly behind him and locking it for good measure. He climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, making him jump. It was a text message from his mom, checking in on him. He quickly replied, assuring her that everything was fine, and put the phone back down. Sleep did not come easily. Every creak and groan of the old house seemed magnified in the darkness. Just as he was starting to doze off, a loud bang jolted him awake. It sounded like it came from downstairs again. Alex's pulse raced as he debated whether to investigate or stay put. Gathering his courage, he grabbed a baseball bat from his closet and crept out of his room. The hallway was eerily silent. He descended the stairs, bat in hand, and made his way to the living room. The front door was wide open, cold air flooding the house. Alex's mind raced. He knew he had locked the door earlier. Someone had been inside the house. He quickly shut and locked the door, his hands trembling. As he turned around, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Written on the wall in what looked like blood were the words, "I'm still here." Panic set in. Alex ran to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and called 911. He explained the situation to the operator, his voice shaking. They assured him that officers were on their way and told him to stay on the line. Minutes felt like hours as he waited. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. Finally, he heard sirens in the distance. Relief washed over him as the police arrived, but his nightmare was far from over. The officers searched the house and found no one. They assured Alex that it was likely a prank, perhaps someone trying to scare him. They took a report and promised to patrol the area throughout the night. Alex felt a bit better but still couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He decided to stay up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. As dawn broke, he finally allowed himself to relax a little. He went to the bathroom to splash some water on his face and noticed something in the mirror. On his neck, just below his ear, was a small, fresh cut. He hadn't felt it before, hadn't noticed it in the chaos of the night. Alex's blood ran cold. Whoever had been in his house had gotten close enough to touch him, to mark him. The police hadn't found anyone, but he knew the truth. Someone had been in his home, and they might come back. From that day on, Alex never felt safe in his own house again. He moved out as soon as he could, but the memory of that night haunted him. He still wonders who or what was in his home that night, and if they might return. Remember, sometimes the things that go bump in the night are very real, and they might be closer than you think. Being alone at night can be unsettling, but what if you weren't really alone? This is the story of Josh, a 25-year-old who thought he was spending a quiet night at home. Instead, he encountered something that would leave him terrified for the rest of his life. It was a rainy Saturday night, and Josh was home alone. His roommates had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving him to enjoy some peace and quiet. He decided to spend the evening binge-watching his favorite horror movies. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and the occasional rumble of thunder added to the spooky ambience. Josh had just finished watching his third movie when he decided to make some popcorn. He paused the TV and walked into the kitchen, the house eerily silent except for the sound of the rain. As he reached for the popcorn bag, he heard a faint tapping sound. He froze, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the back door. He cautiously approached the door and peered out through the small window. The backyard was dark and empty. He shook his head, laughing at his own paranoia, and returned to the kitchen. Just as he was about to start the microwave, the tapping resumed, louder this time. Josh's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, just in case, and slowly opened the back door. The cold, damp air hit him as he stepped outside. The backyard was still empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the side of the house. He followed the sound, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he rounded the corner, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing by the side gate, tapping its fingers on the wooden fence. Josh's blood ran cold. The figure was tall and thin, with long, unkempt hair obscuring its face. Josh called out, "Who's there?" but received no response. The figure stopped tapping and turned slowly towards him. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the figure's face. Josh's breath caught in his throat as he realized the figure had no eyes, just empty, dark sockets staring back at him. Panic set in, and Josh stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. He turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind him. His hands trembled as he locked the door and backed away. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and fast, echoing in the silent house. He tried to call 911, but his phone had no signal. Desperation and fear gripped him as he paced the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do. The tapping resumed, this time on the kitchen window. Josh spun around, and there it was again, the eyeless figure, now tapping on the glass, its fingers leaving streaks of mud. Josh grabbed the knife and held it tightly, his knuckles white. The figure's tapping grew more insistent, louder and faster. Josh shouted, "Go away," but the figure just pressed its face against the window, grinning a toothless smile. Suddenly, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the tapping stopped. Josh's breathing was ragged as he stood frozen in the dark kitchen. He could hear the rain and thunder outside, but nothing else. The silence was deafening. He fumbled for the flashlight and turned it on, the beam shaky as he swept it around the room. The figure was gone, but Josh knew it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness. He decided to make a run for the front door and get to his car. As he moved through the house, every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards made him jump. He reached the front door and yanked it open, but just as he stepped outside, the figure was there, blocking his path. Josh stumbled back, falling to the floor. The figure loomed over him, its eyeless face inches from his own. It whispered, "You shouldn't be alone, Josh." The voice was raspy, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Summoning every ounce of courage, Josh kicked at the figure and scrambled to his feet. He ran out the door, not looking back, and dashed to his car. He fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and jump inside. He locked the doors and started the engine, his hands shaking uncontrollably. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the driveway, watching him with that same eerie grin. Josh didn't stop driving until he reached a friend's house miles away. Josh never went back to that house alone again. He told his roommates what had happened, but they never believed him. They said it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by too many horror movies. But Josh knew the truth. He knew that something sinister had visited him that night, something that still haunted his nightmares. He moved out soon after, but the memory of those eyeless sockets and that chilling whisper stayed with him. So, if you're ever home alone and you hear a tapping at your door or window, remember Josh's story. Sometimes, the things that go bump in the night are more than just a figment of your imagination. Sometimes, they are real, and they are watching you. Have you ever felt the eerie sensation of being watched in your own home? Chris, a 28-year-old man, experienced something far more terrifying one night when he was home alone. What started as a quiet evening quickly turned into a nightmare he will never forget. It was a chilly autumn evening, and Chris had just returned from work. His wife was out of town for a business trip, leaving him alone in their cozy suburban home. Chris enjoyed these rare moments of solitude and planned to spend the night catching up on his favorite TV shows. He made himself a cup of coffee, settled into the living room, and turned on the TV. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as it settled. The wind howled outside, rustling the leaves in the yard. Chris was absorbed in his show when he heard a faint noise coming from the basement. Chris paused the TV and listened. The noise was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It sounded like a whisper or a distant murmur. He shook his head, telling himself it was just the house settling, and resumed watching his show. A few minutes later, the noise returned, louder this time. It sounded like someone was shuffling around in the basement. Chris's curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way to the basement door. He opened the door and peered down the dark staircase. The basement was pitch black, the light switch at the bottom of the stairs just out of reach. Taking a deep breath, Chris descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. At the bottom, he reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The basement was illuminated by a single, dim bulb, casting long shadows across the room. Chris swept the flashlight around, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. Just as he was about to head back upstairs, he noticed something strange. In the far corner of the basement, there was a small door he had never seen before. It was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Chris's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. He reached out and pushed the door open. The flashlight revealed a narrow, hidden passageway, dusty and unused for years. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. He debated whether to explore further or go back upstairs, but curiosity won out. He stepped into the passageway, the walls closing in around him. The air was musty, and cobwebs brushed against his face. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard it again, the whispering. The whispering was clearer now, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. Chris strained to make out the words but couldn't. He followed the sound, the passageway growing narrower and darker. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Panic set in as Chris fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. The whispering grew louder, closer. He could feel a presence behind him, cold and oppressive. His hands trembled as he finally managed to get the flashlight working again. The beam of light revealed something that made his blood run cold. In front of him stood a figure, tall and shadowy, with hollow eyes staring back at him. Chris stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching him. Chris turned and ran, the passageway seeming to stretch on forever. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. He burst out of the passageway and into the basement, slamming the hidden door shut behind him. Chris raced up the stairs and locked the basement door, his hands shaking. He grabbed his phone and called 911, his voice trembling as he explained the situation. The operator assured him that help was on the way and told him to stay on the line. Minutes later, the police arrived and searched the house from top to bottom. They found no one and nothing unusual in the basement. The hidden passageway was gone, as if it had never existed. Chris's story was met with skepticism, but he knew what he had seen. Chris didn't sleep at all that night, and when his wife returned the next day, he told her everything. She was concerned but tried to reassure him that it was just his imagination. Chris wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with him that night, something that was still watching him. He moved out of that house soon after, but the memory of those hollow eyes and the chilling whispers haunted him. So, if you're ever alone at night and hear strange noises coming from your basement, think of Chris's story. Sometimes, the things we can't explain are the ones that stay with us the longest. And sometimes, they are closer than we think.